Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Oh, one more person. Okay. So welcome everybody to the Black and Global panel today. My name is Chiamaka Ukachukwu or Chichi, and I'm the organizer of Black and Global Week as a whole and organized this Black and Global panel today. So I myself am an alum of the Fulbright program and currently serve as a Fulbright alumni ambassador, spent a year abroad in Belgium, and had the idea for Black and Global Week after seeing Black in Chem, Black in Neuroscience, Black Birders Week on social media. So I thought it would be awesome to highlight and amplify the voices of Black scholars who have participated in a variety of international exchange programs. And so that's where the idea for this panel came from. And I have to shout out briefly Olubenga for actually coining the term for the week, Black and Global. So shout out to him, who's also an alum of the Fulbright program. And so I want to thank you all, one, for registering, for attending today. Really excited for the discussion. We have some really awesome scholars here who are doing amazing work all across the globe. So excited to hear what they have to share with us. So we'll go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to ask is for the panelists to introduce themselves. You can say your name, where you are, what you're doing, and any programs that you've participated in.
All right, I'll begin. First off, it's great to be with everybody today. Glad everybody could tune in. My name is Jordyn Hawkins Rippey. I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland. Currently living out here in Kansas City, Missouri. I'm an alumnus of the Fulbright program. I was an English teaching assistant in Malaysia, 2017 to 2018. Phenomenally wonderful experience. And currently I'm out here as an international education professional. So my Fulbright actually propelled me into the field of international education and continuing some of that good work in that field. So glad to be here and glad to have a good dialogue.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Aya Waller-Bay. I am currently a PhD student at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, go blue. And I'm a Detroit native, born and raised in the city of Detroit, and coming live today from Detroit, Michigan. I am an alum of the Gates Cambridge Scholarship. So I spent a year earning my master's at the University of Cambridge in England, had a life-changing time there, which I'll discuss later. And I, too, am super, super happy to be here and to share this space with you all this afternoon.
Hello, everyone. My name is Oluwatobi Iboda. I was originally born in Nigeria, but grew up mostly in America, so I identify as Nigerian American myself. I am currently doing a PhD in the University of Otago in New Zealand. So I went about a different route and decided to do my whole PhD in an entirely different country. And it's been a great and formative experience. I'm very excited to share my experience with you and to hear from the other panelists as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Harriet Karaoke, born and raised in Kenya. I'm currently based in Nairobi, Kenya. I graduated from Harvard University before proceeding to do a scholarship at Peking University under Yenching scholarship. So that is between 2016 to 2018, which is an interesting space since, as you can all imagine, China, the United States, there's not a lot of a good relationship there, but it was a great experience to just understand Chinese economy, Chinese technology from a very much Chinese perspective. I'm currently working as a startup founder, where I co-founded a startup called AfriJob, which is in the human capital space, where we work with fast-growing African companies to match them with top talent, like everyone in this particular conversation. So very much keen to just understand other people's experiences, as well as to share my own experiences, being someone raised in the continent and really experiencing the US and experiencing China, as well as other Asian countries. So super excited to be here. Thank you.
My name is Kiera Konkel. I am a recent graduate from Malone University with a double major in social work and global and international relations. I was a Gilman scholar, so I'm a Gilman scholar alum now, which is very exciting to obtain. So the Gilman scholarship is for undergrad students or for those getting their graduate program started to go abroad and to study. And I studied in a lot of Eastern European countries, mostly focused with working with human trafficking. Currently, I reside in Columbus, Ohio, and I am working as a guardian ad litem with Franklin County Children's Services.
I told you we have some amazing scholars, so I'm really, really excited. So let's go ahead and get into the questions that you all submitted via the RSVP. So the first question is, why did you go abroad? What was your motivation for participating in your particular program? And a related question, how has that time abroad influenced your current endeavors or projects?
Yes, I'll begin, or re-begin, rather. A lot of my travel was relegated to cruise ship travel. So I didn't actually study abroad while I was at Hampton University. Didn't study abroad at all. Got a lot of information about international experiences, but didn't really see a clear route with what I was doing with business. My degree was in business and studying abroad. So I didn't really see a connection there. And what really prompted me to go and pursue the Fulbright experience was there was an adjunct professor at Hampton, Dr. Carlton Long, himself being African-American Rhodes Scholar. And he has an international education company that goes and consults with HBCUs. And they essentially identify these scholarships that are, apt and fitting for the students. So we identified, Fulbright emerging as one of those scholarships for me. And, I kind of knew, just as a person of faith, I kind of knew that was a route that, God was leading me down. And that was the route that, was best for me to engage cross-culturally and mutually edify, those relationships abroad. And I guess for the last question, it has, it's changed me, and there are some other questions about that. It's changed me in ways that I could not have foreseen, but we can get into that, a little later with some of the questions.
Would you mind repeating the question, actually?
Sure, it was a loaded question. So why did you go abroad? What was your motivation for doing so? And how has your time abroad influenced your current endeavors or projects or what you're currently doing?
Perfect. Awesome. So again, everyone who just joined us, I'm Aya Waller-Bay. I am a Gates Cambridge Scholarship alumna. I actually learned about the opportunity via a whim. So I went to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. for undergrad. And after I graduated, I worked as an admissions officer there. So, I was working as an admissions officer, and a classmate of mine actually came to visit. And I was telling her that I really wanted to go back to school. That was ultimately my end goal. And that my time in admissions had really informed my kind of approach to understanding narratives and education in particular. And she said, "Have you heard of the Gates Cambridge Scholarship?" And I had never heard of it. So I did some research that same day in my office while on the clock. And I was like, I can get this. So I reached out to our fellowship office at Georgetown and my mentor, and they said, apply. And next thing you know, I'm across the pond, drinking tea and crumpets and all that, the British type of stuff. And it was absolutely amazing. So, my motivation came from, I'm really risk averse as a first generation college student. I was a low income college student, so I wanted my degrees to be paid for. So the scholarship was full funding. So that worked. At the time I was studying education, and particularly hip hop based education. So I found an advisor there whose energy aligned with my own kind of research. She was super excited to take me on as a student there. So when I saw that the fit of my research interests, my desire to have full funding, and also, my nomadic lifestyle was compatible with just getting on a plane and going to England, I decided to shoot my shot, for lack of better words. And fortunately, it manifested. So ultimately, we're going to, again, talk more about this, but I think my time here, the program was only a year, the master's there quite short. It really, besides the cliche of being a global citizen, it actually complicated my racial identity of being a Black woman, and particularly a Black American woman. who grew up in inner city Detroit, to now be in this space where my Americanness is actually very present and visible, as well as my Blackness, and what is it meant to be a Black woman from America in England, to have the privilege of a Cambridge education, but also being from the hood. It was a lot of different dynamics there, and to feel like a minority of a minority of a minority as an American, I think that was a very eye-opening experience. So I hope to talk a little bit more about that later. So I'll stop there.
So I always had an interest in going abroad during my undergraduate at the University of Michigan, but it was not something I ever really pursued. I didn't really think it was feasible at the time. So after finishing my master's program at the University of Michigan, that interest started to spark up again. I'm like, my original plan was to actually just move to New Zealand for about a year, work there, and then pursue a PhD back in the United States, because that's where I identified as home. But well, I chose New Zealand in the first place because I played rugby for 10 years in the States, and I loved rugby more than any other sport in the world because it's the best sport. And I'd always had a fascination with visiting New Zealand. So I'm like, I wanted to go about doing that. But like, as I was searching for different jobs and opportunities to move over to New Zealand, I'm like, I just ran across a PhD program that really sparked my interest. So I'm doing my PhD in neuroscience, and I thought that it would be an incredible opportunity if I were able to actually pursue a full degree over here in New Zealand. And when I was setting this process out, I first asked Chi-Chi here. We sat down, we had some bubble tea in a little cafe in Ann Arbor. I was like, how are you going abroad? I'm like, she had just really started the Fulbright, or had the idea to apply for the Fulbright. And I'm like, I want to go abroad too. I'm like, so what is the best avenue to do that? Ended up just applying straight to the PhD program here, and through that avenue, and through getting a scholarship through the university, I was able to fund my process and get it abroad, get the visa, and wound up over here. And it has been an incredible experience. I'm like, I agree with Aya. Like, it was the first time I was ever identified as like an American. Oh yeah, you're American. That's what you are. I'm like I had to deal with that new identity and redefining of who I was, and like over the course of several years. And it's been a very interesting experience, and perhaps the most formative experience of my life. I'm still here in New Zealand. I'm entering the third year of my PhD as of yesterday, and doing well with that. So I'm keen to answer more of the questions as we continue.
It's great to hear from everyone and the experiences. Mine started in my undergraduate career when I decided to study abroad for my undergraduate. So as I mentioned, born and raised in Kenya, I went to high school here. And when I was really thinking about the next step for me, I was keen very much on an education system that would allow me to just, figure things out. Because, you're a teen who doesn't know anything. And a lot of our education system here, you're forced into like one path that you stick around with for the rest of your life. So I knew that wasn't what I really wanted. I didn't know whether I wanted to do actuarial science, which was called for in the University of Nairobi. So the first step for me to study abroad and getting into Harvard was interesting because that really exposed me to a lot of history, a lot of resources that I hadn't had access to. And during my college career, I remember I did a major in political science or government there, and a minor in East Asian studies. And the reason why I was very much intrigued in East Asia as opposed to even the US was I was really trying to understand, like, how can you lift people out of poverty? Like, I studied political science and I had a little bit of experience with like really understanding political system because I wanted to see how power works. And across the board, when I was understanding about power, I realized that, the reason why Africa is the way it is because of power and like how the power dynamics are working. And I would look to the East and see Singapore and see South Korea and see all these tiger giants or miracle babies or just miracle countries that were just doing incredible things that had come from poverty into doing incredible things in terms of the economy. And that really fascinated me. And I remember my first conversation with, during my freshman program, we call it like FIP program, I talked to this one amazing lady who ended up becoming one of my friends, who was really passionate about South Korea and talking about the South Korean culture and South Korean music. And I just come from a place where I wasn't proud about my country. I wasn't like flashing and saying I'm from Kenya and how incredible Kenya is, because I didn't know about much about my own country. So it was incredible to just hear someone passionate about their country and really impressive. And I decided to study abroad there. So I went there over my freshman summer. It was an interesting experience. And I really was fascinated by culture, by the politics there, by the economy. And I really wanted to just understand more about South Korea. That led me to Japan. So I did more studies in Japan. I studied abroad there for my sophomore summer. And from there, I got this intriguing conversation about how Japan and Korea all hit China, politically speaking. And I was really fascinated by that. And I was like, okay, I need to understand China now. So it was during that period of time, I was working also on my senior thesis on trying to compare Japanese soft power with Chinese soft power in the continent. And that was really fascinating because Japan had just come from really pumping a lot of money into the continent, and China had just really skyscraped a lot of the investment that was coming into the continent. And really that was a very fascinating conversation around the future of Africa with a focus with China and a lot of this influence coming in. So I knew that I really wanted to position myself and understand China, because as you can imagine, when you're learning China in America, it's a very different script. It's really tailored to the American audience. And when you go to China and understanding China from a Chinese perspective, you're really understanding Chinese from a Chinese perspective. So I knew I needed to understand the unfiltered version of China, because I was coming from a perspective of, for the continent's sake, I need to understand what really means for Chinese investment getting into the continent. So I found this amazing program called the Yenching Scholarship that is a 2-year program where you study, sponsored by the Chinese government, where you study in China in Peking University. You really understand the Chinese system. You're taught by Chinese professors. You learn Chinese as a language. And you also get to do a thesis that is very much comparative. So they give you a chance to really dig into your existing culture or your comparative study and really do that comparative study. So for me, I was also very much interested in the tech space within China. As you all know, the tech space there is vibrant, starting from TikTok, for example. So I was able to really tour down in Shenzhen, where I was able to understand a lot of this hardware ecosystem. I was very fascinated by Tencent, which is a giant there when it comes to the tech space. And some of these stories of Alibaba that was non-existent 10, 15 years ago now, which is occupying a lot of the global e-commerce marketplace, and trying to really understand their journey and looking back at the continent and just seeing how it's in the beginning space when it comes to technology. That was a really experiential space for me to look ahead and be like, okay, this is where the continent can be in the next 10, 15 years. And that comparative angle made me realize that I needed to be in the continent so that I can be able to really build my own company and understand where, because it's a futuristic understanding of where the continent can be within the next number of years. So that experience was very interesting for my own focal point, where I'm currently running a business within the tech space, which is human tech. And within that space, it's also as you can imagine, the continent is projected to have one of the youngest population, under 25 years old, one of the youngest population. And that means that we can either have massive unemployment or just unlock a lot of opportunity from this young population. So just really putting ourselves in there to really understand how then can we unlock a lot of this African youth potential to ensure that they're doing meaningful jobs, and having access to a lot of these global jobs is very important within the company that I co-founded with my co-founder who I met in college, as well as my master's program. So as you can see, these programs really helped me find my co-founder, who really shared the same understanding of what it takes to move the economy of most African countries to the next level through unlocking human capital. So for me, the scholarships and the fellowships have really opened my eyes to just understand where the continent can be. And I think my problem with the American system was that America is so many light years ahead that it's very hard for you to scale and see where you can be. But when you look at India, when you look at other countries, you really start projecting and understanding where places can be, or companies can be, or countries can be. And that really helped me really even build the foundation of my company at the moment. So the fellowship for me and the experiences helped me open my eyes towards more than just what is seen there in the newspaper or like in statistics, but actually the culture there. So the languages really helped me unlock a lot of these conversations and unlock a lot of this, great social capital that is very critical as you're building businesses and as you're raising money. And I can talk more about that entrepreneurship route, but I do feel like that globalness really puts you in a point where you can make better decisions because you have more access to knowledge that usually is locked up by a language barrier. So when you're able to really unlock that language barrier, you're able to access some of this foundational information that is critical to growth across different aspects.
So I am just finished my bachelor's program, so I'm probably one of the youngest in the group, which I guess is exciting in some ways. It gives a little bit of a different perspective, but I finished in 3.5 years, which is very exciting. As another first-generation college student, it's very excited to be an example for all of my younger siblings. There's 7 younger ones, so that's very exciting for me. I am from Malone University, and I double majored in social work and international relations for those who joined late with the Gilman scholarship to help me during my abroad experience. But the decision to apply for the Gilman scholarship was based upon a trip I took before deciding to double major. I was just majoring in social work, and we took a trip to Chocobamba, Bolivia, and we worked with children and women in the red light district, which is where my love and my eyes were opened to just how much other countries have normalized in some ways the aspects of human trafficking as that just being the only option or just the option that's been in the cycle of their families. And then to go and experience that for 2 weeks and to like have conversations with children and them tell me they're going to just do the same things because that's the only option they have. That's how you make money. That's how that works. And then to come back home and to realize that there are so many ways as Americans with so many resources you can go and partner with other countries and other companies and help to spread awareness about how there are other options for women and children to be successful and to make names of themselves was something that really inspired me as a social worker. So I decided to become an international social worker. And so I took a trip abroad to Eastern Europe, and I spent a lot of time in Russia, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Germany, Finland, and those countries around those areas. And we spent a majority of our time meeting the women and children in those areas, learning about their schooling, spreading awareness about human trafficking and about the things that were going on there while working on our own studies. That was more of an immersive type of involvement with that. But that was absolutely one of my motivations, is because in the US, we have a lot more resources and a lot more knowledge of human trafficking. Yes, it's still a huge issue in our country, but we have more resources to try to combat it. Whereas in other countries, some countries have normalized it, that they don't realize that it's something that needs to be combated.
Thank you all for your answers to those questions. So I'm definitely hearing, and this kind of flows well into one of the submitted questions, just kind of talking about your experiences as a Black person in your host country, and how living abroad has informed your relationship with your racial and ethnic identity was one of the specific questions. So just kind of, one, hearing all of your stories, I'm just fangirling because this is all amazing, dope, exciting work. But also interested to see how that global experience has kind of just shifted your perspective or your experiences as a Black person in those spaces.
Yeah, I'll start with that question. So for me, it was very intentional to make sure that the narrative of people of the African diaspora were seen and also espoused within the international community. And that appears in a wide variety of ways. The diplomatic corps, increasing more diversity in foreign service, increasing more diversity in these international exchange programs. And for me specifically, I took it from a stance of increasing my faith as not only a African-American male, but a Christian African-American male in a majority Muslim country. And so I was able to engage with a wide variety of citizens in my respective area through interfaith methods. And so we have very candid conversations about Islam and Christianity and what that looked like, how that played out. I fasted with my community during the month of Ramadan. And, for me, from that standpoint, the welcoming arms that I received initially, but also throughout my time there in Malaysia, it was really appalling because, you know, we're almost subjugated to so much psychological and, you know, just spiritual damage here in the United States, and to go abroad and to be able to freely express your authentic self and have that authentic self be celebrated, it's like cognitive dissonance of you know, sorts. It's like, well, I know this is true and I know this is how I'm treated here, but I'm treated so differently here. And that changed my entire perspective on things politically. It changed my entire perspective on what it means to find work that you're, you know, fulfilled in. And it changed my perspective on our narrative as African Americans in the international space as well, and the intentionality in which we have to address the dearth of our presence just in the space overall. So bringing that back, focusing, you know, now as an international education professional, focusing on how do we internationalize the HBCU campus? You know, how do we internationalize campuses through, you know, different methods or different initiatives that even Fulbright might have in place. You know, I presented virtually for this year's NAFSA annual conference on that very poster about how to internationalize the HBCU campus specifically, but more broadly also MSI institutions. And so for me, it was a very eye-opening experience to just be my authentic self. So often, you know, so often we have to put on a facade. We have to have this double consciousness, if you will, that Du Bois, you know, speaks of. But when I was abroad, that came off in a very free-flowing type of manner.
Thank you so much, Jordyn, for sharing that. So I mentioned earlier some of perhaps the challenges, also kind of epiphanies I had studying abroad in England. And I forgot to say in my introduction, so I actually studied abroad in Germany as an undergraduate student at Georgetown, because I started at the institution actually minoring in German, because I'd studied it in high school for years. I had a terrible experience in Germany and actually vowed never to go back because of the amount of overt racism that I experienced I was there for a summer, so for about 2 months. So that kind of tainted, frankly, my experience about Germany as a country, and also to a minimal extent Europe as a continent. But again, I got this opportunity to study abroad, to get my master's at the University of Cambridge in England. And, you know, the Gates Cambridge Scholarship, at the time when I received it, there were only 40 Americans that they could receive the scholarship, each cohort. Now it's only 25. So it's super competitive. And I came in a cohort with about less than 10 other Black students. So Black students were always underrepresented in the fellowship. But again, as I mentioned earlier, to be a Black, particularly first generation low-income college student, we're incredibly rare in that fellowship. And that's both as American citizens, but also for the international students who were from, say, the continent of Africa or other places in the diaspora. There were very few low-income students to earn that fellowship. So I really felt like it was challenging because there was an assumption of wealth that as an American citizen, that they just thought I maintained, right? So I was often kind of grouped up. If you're American, you're rich. If you're American studying at Cambridge, you were rich. And again, that wasn't my experience. There were also very difficult class challenges. And in particularly England, where they have such a strong representation of folks from both the continent of Africa and the Caribbean because of colonization, I also felt like a minority because there were very few Black Americans, and people identified by their nationality in a way that I wasn't familiar with, right? So I was like, I'm Black, from Detroit, and people were like, I am from Ghana. And I was like, okay, you know, so it was a very different experience. I didn't feel like I fit in that regard either. So it was challenging on one hand because of that, but also to Jordyn's point, it was liberating where I didn't feel like I had to be one type of person. I really felt, like I could be myself. I really, fell in love with living, particularly in Cambridge. It was actually one of the safest I felt in my entire life because of the lack of police with guns, frankly. There was never a threat of gun violence that I feel living in the United States, frankly. They have serious issues with racism and white supremacy, so I'm not going to say it as a utopian, but they don't have the threat of gun violence like we have here in the United States. So there were certainly, again, challenges kind of navigating that and complicating, again, Blackness, which I think was important for my personal growth, but also there was a level of liberation of just being in a different place that I really appreciated. So those are my thoughts on that.
So my experience as a African-American man in New Zealand, there are not a lot of other Black people here. I'm the first PhD student within my department, in the history of my department, and the second ever Black student to come through my department. It was very isolating initially, but I did have those, as I mentioned before, those questions about my identity, because I had to rethink of who I am exactly. I had to redefine who I am through a different lens. In America, I was never defined as American, despite the fact that I grew up most of my life in America. I moved to America when I was 4 or 5, but I was always Nigerian. I was always somewhere else. Oh, where are you from? Because you're not from here. But as soon as I moved to New Zealand, I was identified immediately as American. And being identified as American was not something that I knew I had needed at the time in my time in America. Yeah, I'm Nigerian American. But when I moved over here, it was, yes, you are American. Of course you're American. You may have been born somewhere else, but you spend your time in America. You have all these American influences. So of course you're American. And that was something that really bolstered my identity. And I feel like New Zealand gave me the opportunity to choose who I am, to develop into ways and grow in ways and heal in many ways that I couldn't have done back in America. The environment simply wouldn't condone it. There you're always defined as by certain elements of racism as less than, whereas I'm not to say racism doesn't exist over here. That's not true. But I live in an environment that allows me to grow and develop in so many different ways. And I've taken those opportunities to learn about myself and to develop myself into someone that I am continuously more proud of each and every single day. And the opportunities that I have here that I necessarily wouldn't have been able to pursue in America, or just the confidence to pursue those type of opportunities. Because I know my race won't be necessarily a issue or a systemic issue preventing me from reaching or achieving these goals or positions. I know that I can walk outside and not be judged immediately as a threat because of the color of my skin. And something that New Zealand does better than America. There is no gun violence over here. I'm not under threat from a police officer who just might shoot me for literally no reason. That's just not something that I have to deal with or think about. So I was able to shift my mind and from a mindset of survival to actual living, and to actually pursuing those sorts of avenues, or pursuing other sort of interests, or learning how to do things that not for any reason to survive, but just to enjoy life. Going skiing for no reason. I'm terrible at it, but I go skiing sometimes. And that was a very different experience. But at the same time, there's not a lot of Black people here. I have to make a concerted effort in order to find people who look like me or find people who have similar experiences to me. I have yet to meet another Black American, like in the 3 years that I've been here. I know they exist. I think they're on the other island, but I'm like, well, I've yet to meet some of them. So any people that I do meet is because I made that effort or because I've joined student organizations, like, and there's like a clear age difference. I'm like, indeed, because I'm 31, I'm like doing a PhD. So with my degree, I'm often just in the lab all day. And I've met like a very good group of individuals more recently, and especially with the recent Black Lives Matter movements, and being able to like congregate and meet and like talk to and get to know a lot of these people. And they're like, oh, I know all the Black people in Dunedin, the city I currently live in. I'm like, how come I haven't met you yet? And I was like, well, I'm in the lab all the time. But the fact that you're able to say that you know all the Black people is also kind of a problem, because that's 100% feasible. There's probably less than 100 of us here in a city of 100,000. So it has been a very formative experience. It has allowed me to develop as a person, as myself, and to just truly take those masks off and not have to worry about my day-to-day survival. But it's also been a formative experience, and because I'm alone a lot of the time. So it's great, but it comes with its own issues and challenges that I've had to overcome and deal with, and to grow through that as well.
Okay, Harriet is back. Okay.
Sorry, guys. That will happen occasionally. But to just answer the question about my experience, I think one of the things I never knew, I did not know, maybe this will come weird, but I did not know I was Black. But that is like something across the board a lot of us Africans face, is that we actually don't know our race until we leave the continent. And to give even more perspective, in Swahili, there's no word, Swahili, which is like a national-ish language, we don't have a word that's like for race, which is interesting. I didn't know about this until I figured that out. So when I went to the US, that was the first time I realized I'm not only Black, but I'm actually African, which was like, I didn't know, there was layers of being Black. So it's like, okay, I'm not just Black, I'm African, which means that, being African. And I remember in Harvard, there was like the African Students Association, the African American Students Association. And sometimes for some reason, there was a lot of friction. It's like, I remember the Black Lives Matter movement. I did not know when to participate, because I was like, if I go to this protest, I might lose my visa and go home, and that doesn't align well with any of my studies. So like, I did not actually know where my Blackness existed in this narrative of like Black Lives Matter. And I think one of my biggest discovery across my experiences abroad was that I needed to first start at realizing that, what does it mean to be African? And to give even more perspective, like a lot of African countries, even like Kenya, for example, like our history is even hidden from a lot of citizens. So our history is very much doctored to just make sure that the narrative makes sense. And I learned so much about the continent outside the continent. There's more resources about Africa outside Africa. That's when I learned about some of these things that, really I didn't learn in my high school career or in my primary school, or even within my narratives with my friends and my family. So for me, it was just a disruptor when I realized that I'm not only just a woman, I'm also a Black woman. And I'm not just a Black woman, I'm an African woman. And this was even more apparent when I left the US and went to Asia, where, in Asia, there's not a lot of interaction with Black people. So of course they put you into one bracket of like Black people. But, it's interesting when, when you're talking about American in New Zealand, for me, it was more of like, okay, being an African in Asia, you can imagine a lot of stereotypes across the board. I had experienced a lot of stereotypes when I was in Harvard myself, when people were asking me whether we still ride lions and gazelles to school. I was like, what are you doing in Harvard? If you don't know anything about the continent, you should not be here. So, I didn't blame anyone in China when they were asking me some of these questions, because I experienced the same questions when I was in Harvard. So I was like, okay, this seems like I need to start representing my continent. Africa is a country now. I need to start representing everything. I need to understand every single thing about the continent. So it became more of a task for me to really understand the history, understand the politics, understand the economy, because I didn't know a lot of these things. And a lot of these resources are outside the continent, which is even more striking and surprising, not surprising as much. So for me, my experience abroad was really to tell me that I am deeply African, and I need to learn and unlearn a lot of the things that I had learned when I'm here. And that has really, you talked about double consciousness. I feel like here is levels of colonialism that we can even reach to the level of optimizing and unlocking opportunities for Black people in the continent, because there's levels of so much that is ingrained upon us: colorism, colonialism, racism. And so I'm still learning. I'm still unlearning some of the things. I'm not there yet. I'm not perfect. I'm learning a history every day. I'm trying to just keep myself updated about just my past, my ancestors. I'm becoming, if you talk to a lot of people, English is speaking English is good. It's like, it puts you in a good social capital, but a lot of us don't speak our mother tongue languages. I speak Kikuyu, which is my mother tongue, and then I speak Swahili, which is our national language, and I speak English, which is our official language, and now all these amazing languages that I learned during my study abroad experiences. But for me is when I go to China and understand that 2,000 plus years of history, how they know themselves, and look around my peers in the continent and how we do not know ourselves. We just know 50 years. 50 years, that's all we know. And then you realize that, there's so much to learn, and there's so much to appreciate about the things the continent has, whether that's oral traditions, whether that's learning from our grandparents, whether it's appreciating some of the things that we go through in our day-to-day basis. So for me, it has been just understanding that I'm not just Black, I'm African, which brings a lot of responsibilities for not just myself to learn, but my peers. So for example, one of the things I started when I came back home is a group called Semezane, which in Swahili means let's talk, where it's a lot of people, when they leave the continent, they're just awakened. They realize they're not African Americans, and you're left in this, limbo of what does it mean to be African? Is there resources for an African? When you're going through adolescence, there's usually resources when you're teen, but when you're going through this awakening of being African, there's no resources. So we try to bring together our community and talk about some of these things. When you start realizing things about corruption and how that is tied with colonialism, when you start understanding some of the things that are happening in the continent and how it's tied with global politics, then you start understanding some of these things. You start loving yourself. So for me, it's really self-love. It has boiled down to loving myself, loving my hair, loving my skin, loving my every single part of myself, which I think that is the fundamental journey for me across the board.
A whole word, a whole sermon. Just had to comment.
I will keep mine really short just so we can get to some other questions as well, but they mostly covered some of my bigger concerns when leaving. I grew up in a very, not the best wording, but white raised or whitewashed type of lifestyle. So my grandmother enforced us to be as facadely dressed as possible, to make sure our hair was done and all those things as a young child raising up. And then when I went to college, I went to a predominantly white college. I think there was a total of 5 African Americans on our campus. So my going abroad experience, I was prepared for it to just be a majority of Europeans who were all Caucasian looking. But during my experience, I went to LCC International University, and it had students of every race, creed, color. And so it was an experience that I think when I went, I wasn't prepared for. And then I went, and I was more excited to be in that type of atmosphere than the atmosphere that I was raised. it was like you get to learn different cultures, you did learn different languages. Everyone wants to know about your language. Everyone wants to like learn about your culture and embrace theirs. And I met so many wonderful people that my experience abroad was great when on campus. But when I did like independent travels, or I would go around the city by myself or to go get groceries, that's when things started to like come out, where like men would approach me and ask me where I was from, or like ask me if I was American. Especially it would happen in Russia, where they would assume like everybody else mentioned that you were wealthy. And so like people would just hassle you, just assuming that. And being an African-American female, the most common thing that happened to me, and still when I travel to Europe, is that people stare, or that they assume that I'm very rich from just my presentation or the clothes that I wear. And so I have to be very cautious with like pickpocketing or people following me places to make sure that I'm in public settings more often than not, or I have a male friend with me, which is not something I usually have to experience in America, is that I can just freely go wherever I wish to, just being an independent person. But those were like some of the things. But other than that, it was an incredible experience being there. I got a lot of compliments most of the time. People loved my skin tone. They were like, it's such a pretty shade of brown. It's like, it's so amazing. People compared me to Tyra Banks, which has never happened in my life, which was one of the, I think, the best compliments I've gotten from people from an international setting, as they'll come and ask me those types of questions. And I'm like, I'm very flattered. Thank you. Like that you think that it's a beautiful color, because you don't always get that in America, where people think being African-American or African is beautiful. So it was an amazing time for me.
Ooh, thank you all for those responses. I was over here getting emotional because I resonated with every single point that was mentioned here. Definitely one, the experience of not identifying as American until you're overseas. And it's almost like they place your nationality first before your race in certain contexts, which was definitely unsettling. But, it's really beautiful to hear that everyone felt like, they could, at least in some cases, even though racism is prevalent everywhere, at least there was some freedom with the respect that you didn't have to worry about being, murdered by police on a sunny afternoon. I think there's just kind of a level of relief that is just kind of always present with you as you navigate these experiences, regardless if you have, a racist encounter or something like that. I think I had mentioned that point. I remember in Belgium, seeing police cars and like not stressing out at all, because I was like, oh, they're not gonna, kill me. They might harass me, but they won't kill me. So for sake of time, we have about 5 minutes left, so I just want to respect people's time. I'm gonna give people the ability to unmute themselves. So if anyone has any pressing questions that they want to ask, otherwise, I will finish with one last question. So I'll go ahead and allow you all to unmute yourselves. And if you want to ask a specific question, feel free.
I have a question.
Yes.
My name is Alvin, and I'm from Africa. I'm from Kenya. And my question is this. Okay, I've been seeing like there are some, let's say, musicians from America who come to Africa to perform. For instance, J. Cole went to Nigeria a couple of years back, and the African Americans in the US were really talking badly about Africans. They said that you guys, you better, okay, they were saying also Africans also have Wi-Fi. They also have, what else did they say, iPhones. Is there electricity in Africa? I'm actually surprised. Some asked, how do the people in Africa tweet? Then someone responded, they put a letter, in a letter, then the tweet bot sends it to Twitter. So I don't know why, but okay, from all that I got, African Americans who are actually in America look down on Africans who are here in Africa. And they need petitions to be signed, and I've seen this on Twitter, so many Africans from Africa sign those petitions on behalf of the African Americans in America. Yet they look down on us. I don't know if that was a question, but I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so why does that happen? And we're literally all
address that question. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, I might try to do it. So obviously there's been a bastardization of just African history, in the curricula here in the United States. And what that does, that leads to a disconnect between members of the diasporic community, if you will. And so when that history isn't taught, or knowledge of self, or, you know, knowing thyself, if you will, is not taught to Black Americans, that's where the disconnect comes from. Also, in terms of just global mobility, there are increasing numbers now, and there's an influx, especially now, given everything politically and just the state of, you know, racial unrest. More Black Americans are now traveling abroad, and more now, even with some countries such as Ghana, are now welcoming Black Americans, you know, with the year of the return. And so that's kind of alleviating that, but it stems from not knowing, it really just stems from not knowing history, in my own opinion, and not knowing geographically and politically how infrastructure is built in a place that you don't know a lot about. And it's hard to know how infrastructure is built when you don't have that information readily being taught. So I hope that tries to answer your question, Alan.
So thank you, Jordyn, for answering that. And I think I'll just add the point. I think it's important to note that, you know, while some people may have those attitudes, that's certainly not the case for a lot of Black Americans. So I've definitely had those experiences where people, and I think Harriet mentioned this, you know, she's like, why are you at Harvard if you don't know what's going on in the continent, which I thought was just kind of a beautiful response to that. But there are certainly Black Americans born and raised who appreciate the culture, who understand the culture, uplift the culture as well. But I think, you know, that's a discussion we could have for hours on end. It is certainly an issue, but something I've seen at least shifting towards a positive perspective. So we have 2 minutes left. There is one more question, I think kind of relevant to this topic, that is loaded and I'd like to ask. So before I do, since it is 3:58 and I'm not sure if this Zoom is going to close out on us, the first thing I'd like to do is just thank all of the panelists for taking their time to be here today to talk about their experiences. We sincerely and truly appreciate all of your perspectives. You know, my wheels are already turning for like, okay, part 2, part 3, part 4. We were not able to get through all of the questions because, as you can see, you know, we have a lot of diversity in the perspectives here, experiences. So, you know, I apologize that we couldn't answer all of the questions. I want to thank the participants for attending as well and engaging, asking really thoughtful, meaningful questions. And then a few plugs for Black and Global Week for the rest of the week. You can find the schedule for the week on Twitter as well as Instagram. So it's Black and Global on Twitter, Black and Global Week on Instagram. And basically, if you're on social media, we're looking to highlight you, amplify your voices, so we can have, even on a small scale, similar experiences. Because I think it's extremely important that people can see themselves reflected in these programs, especially as Black scholars. We are typically least represented across all programs, you know, especially when it comes to international exchange. So it's just really important that your voices are heard, and I will be amplifying them all week. So with that, if people have to go, they are free to sign off. But I think if the panelists have like a few minutes, I will ask another question from the RSVPs, because I'm curious to hear y'all's response on this one. So someone asked, and maybe Harriet could touch on this, or anyone, what steps do we need to take to decolonize international education? I thought that was a really interesting question, and especially about the comments you made about how like some of the history is just not available. Those resources don't exist on the continent. I mean, I didn't know that. I wouldn't know that, but curious to hear everyone's perspective on that.
That's as you're saying, it's a very loaded question. One of the things that someone mentioned in the chat is about just confirming about how, for you to really access some of these resources, you have to be intentional. So it has to be really intentional, which is unfortunate, means that no one has access to some of these resources. but one of the things I'm very thankful for is the internet. I think one of the things that the internet has done is democratizing access to content. And some of these things you had to go to the walls and the, go to Widener Library in Harvard to like go through materials that was collected in the continent to read about the continent. But now a lot of this material is it's online. So you can really consciously decide to just understand some of these things about the continent, which I think that really makes sure that a lot of us, especially within the continent, know some of these things. Like, to give you an example, like when it comes to some of the things that happened during the colonial period, there's some of the facts that are not shared in the public in terms of like some of the humiliation, some of the massive genocides that happened within the continent by the Germans, for example. Some of these things are just not present, and we just walk around like nothing happened. So I think we normalize colonialism, which is like the first step, which is quite unfortunate. And whenever we bring out colonialism, we're told to, it was a long time ago, we need to like, forget about it and, move on. But then when you look at when you look at the economies and you look at political landscape, especially tribalism, for example, which is like a critical part of our political landscape, you realize a lot of this is tied to colonialism, which means that we really need to attack the problem and, move on from there. And it's really, studying Asia was interesting because Japan is really much lent by China and South Korea for the things that they did during the occupation in different spaces, especially across Asia. And they usually ask, the countries have been pushing for an apology from the empire, right? So that, people can move on, whether that's like really moving on. So that's one of the things that has been happening. But as you can imagine, the Chinese history is very much layered. So people know about their history. People know what Japan did to them. When you go to South Korea, the comfort women, people understand what Japan did to the women in Korea. So people can know what they're asking from the Japanese whenever they're looking about their history. But when you look at our history, people don't know what to ask from the British. We don't know what to ask from the French. We don't know what to ask from the Germans, because we actually have no idea of what happened in scales or in just the exact numbers. So in terms of decolonizing our education system, it really has to start from like transparency. I think transparency is the first and most important things, where we need to be okay to like ensure that the population understands its history. And that's where governments don't want that to happen, because it's chaotic. So it's a top-down, bottom-up approach. And I think one of the most practical things that I've been thinking around with my friends, and we have been trying to also act upon it, is oral traditions. So one of the things that we are so good at in the continent is passing down oral traditions, and like through stories, through songs, dances. So your grandmother can tell you about the Mau, for example. My grandmother, was involved during the independence time. My father has had stories from his grandfather, and he's able to share some of these things that happened to them. And some of these things, when they're passed down through generations, and when you are able to, like, again, using the internet, when you're able to bring a lot of these stories together, you can be able to like start making sense and making a lot of sense of some of the stories that happened or history that happened. Because your grandmother has one point of view, but another grandmother can bring another point of view, and you can create a real story. And I know they did that with 9/11, where everyone talked about where they were at when the bomb blast happened, and people started creating an interesting kind of like story of what really happened. So that can be a great next step. And unfortunately for us, we are running out of time, because a lot of our grandparents are passing away. So we need to really get to hear from them and understand some of the experiences, because they're the ones who are the custodians of a lot of our history. Because unfortunately for us, we can't get access to a lot of these resources. The kids in the middle of the nowhere in the village don't have access to these resources. They don't have internet to start with. And unfortunately, the internet is not as penetrated as you're hoping for, but that's the point of the government. But oral traditions are very important. And everyone has access to an older person who can provide a lot of this information. And I think one of the things that young people have been doing across the continent is storytelling. So if you look at TikTok, for example, people have been creating content and really sharing some of these experiences. And I talked about Samezane. We were talking about Liberia, for example, which went through years and years of interesting history. But when you talk to people who are Liberians, who talk about their grandparents, they have a completely different history from what's written on the books. which means that there's something in there which has disparities. But like your grandmother who went through different aspects doesn't come up with a biased situation. They went through very interesting times. So collecting a lot of this oral content and oral information through WhatsApp, for example, which is like widespread across the continent, you can have a lot of this oral history tallied together and creating content that can be really understood by, you know, in your own language. So my grandmother can speak in Kikuyu, and that can be really, I can translate that to English, which can mean that we can really bring all these stories together and like create a decolonized education. So education has to move away from books. Someone talked about how 97% plus of our education system is very westernized. It has to go back to our grandparents, has to go back to our, you know, our older generation who have to tell us what happened. And I think that's where the beginning of the decolonialism happens. Again, top down, the government has to be very much, you know, focused on ensuring that we are unlocking a lot of this potential by understanding decolonialism is part of the agenda. But again, everyone has their own side agendas. So it's not always, it's impossible to trust our governments when it comes to education and prioritizing the same. But from bottom up communities and engaging the same, there's a lot of opportunity within oral traditions. And whoever is actually in the space of, I think usually call them anthropology. Yeah. So the anthropologists in the house, I think that's a great job for you guys to bring a lot of this content together, the data scientists, how to really create a lot of this content, and the content creators to distribute this. But I think Africa Rising narrative can start with our grandparents. So how can we bring them alive and tell their stories? I think that's the first and the most practical solution that could happen now before it's too late.
Thank you, Harriet, for that perspective. Aya, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I had an actually different interpretation of the question about decolonizing international education, and actually thought a lot about Jordyn's work as a professional about what it means to increase access to just a literal international education, and how often, particularly traveling abroad, and I'm speaking particularly in an American context, has appeared to be inaccessible, and particularly for Black Americans or people who live here in the United States. America has exported a lot of things, whether it be hip hop, a certain fashion, but we've also exported our conceptions of race to other places in the world that don't understand race or racialize their people in the same way that we do. And consequently, that has altered how people, you know, have perceived what it means to travel abroad. And I think Alvin's question about the negative stereotypes and representations that Black Americans have about people on the continent is a part of that, right? So I see it as, what does it mean to increase accessibility to information, to actually increase literal accessibility to studying abroad, which I think this panel does a great job of, you know, chipping away of, like, you know, taking away the inaccessibility of what does it mean to gain a fellowship or a scholarship, to study abroad, to get a degree abroad, to have an internship abroad. I think that is one way that we do that, by helping people to see that it's not this, you know, difficult task. Well, I mean, it is challenging, let me not say that, but it is something that people, if you work towards, you too could kind of secure a fellowship or opportunity that could take you outside of your comfort zone and really push you forward. So I think that's one approach to kind of decolonizing international education and what it means to do it. Also, again, I think to Harriet's point, I mean, frankly, the word decolonization was not a part of, like, my lexicon or rhetoric when in the United States. It wasn't until I got to Cambridge where I kept hearing about decolonize the curriculum, decolonize the actual colleges, take the portraits of the old white people off the walls. And I think that's also an important step about what are we consuming? You know, what are we reading? What types of authors and scholars are we engaging? Who are we following on Instagram? I mean, I think perception of whether it be the continent or the global South could be altered by seeing people that look like us in those spaces. That's an important way that we continue to do that. Jordyn mentioned that Ghana, particularly, there was the year of the return this past year before Corona, that a lot of people went to Ghana and got to experience it. A lot of, you know, Black Americans and other people across the African diaspora got to see Ghana, you know, with their own two eyes, and I think that was a beautiful thing. So I do think increasing accessibility, increasing visibility, and also challenging the narratives that we consume. You know, are we following those, I don't know, OTEP conspiracy theories on YouTube, or are we like interacting with people that we actually know, or people who are, you know, verified and credible sources about their personal experiences, like we're doing here on this panel? So I think this is one step closer to helping to decolonize international education.
All the snaps. Did anyone else want to comment on that? Oh, Jordyn, I see you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief because I have a lot. Kind of being in the field of international education and seeing it up close, I'll tackle it from this perspective. There are two things that have to be like really fundamentally addressed. So the first thing is intercultural competency across all of these programs, whether it's Mitchell, Marshall, Rhodes, Schwartzman, you know, into the entire gamut. Intercultural competency has to be emphasized over theory. And then secondly, since there can be a total upheaval of, you know, the numerous people who don't have that intercultural competency, whether it's in diplomatic corps, whether it's in these international programs, since we can't just overhaul all these individuals, we have to be intentional about getting into spaces and promoting our narratives. So the first thing that I experienced, as I'm sure a lot of my fellow panelists have experienced, you have a lot of students, a lot of Black students who have the theoretical framework laid out. You know, that some of them come from the academy, some of them don't. Very unique and varied backgrounds. And they can speak on all of these topics. They can speak on statecraft, diplomacy, how to negotiate. They can speak on all these topics. When it comes to engaging the actual people in those countries that they have studied so extensively, they fail. And I, for the longest time, tried to figure out, why do they fail? They've studied it in college. They're international relations majors. They have, you know, concentration subspecialties. Why are these cultural mishaps or faux pas still happening? And it comes from the fact that you can't expect somebody to be uprooted from, let's say you have a Fulbright ETA from Wisconsin or Maine, let's say Maine, you know. Now, just geographically speaking, there are not a lot of people that look like us in Maine, certainly. So you're asking them to now uproot and now bring those same set of values, socialization, background that they have, and now bring it to a new country, not leave it at the door, but bring it to a new country and give training and expect them to become these proficient cultural ambassadors. It doesn't happen that way, you know. So that's where the frustration comes from on the ETAs of color, their side, because we're confused, you know, in the Fulbright program. At least I could say I was confused about some of the things that were happening in my cohort. So we have to train intercultural competence. We have to train cross-cultural communication in such a way, whether it's facilitated through, you know, some type of government, whether, you know, in our side, State Department, or, you know, the embassies, or whether it's some other organization that does it, it has to be done to at least alleviate that. So that's the first part. The second part is, I believe that we should have people in these spaces and not just kind of throw rocks at the ivory tower, right? So you have to get in these spaces to be able to affect change. Now, the key to that is the people who are in the spaces and the people who are not in the spaces. The people who are in the spaces have to be able to work with the people outside of the establishment to create sustainable change. The people inside of the establishment can't look down on the people outside of the establishment because they are not, you know, playing the game, if you will. The people outside the establishment can't look at the people inside the establishment and say, well, you're never going to get anything done. Look at the record. You know, what is the record indicated? What's precedent tell us about, you know, getting concessions in this area? So they have to work together. The knowledge transfer in the academy has to be there, because scholars in the university or the academy, their work is the work that promotes diplomacy most in my opinion, most effectively, rather than trying to sit down, go through the treaties, go through trade negotiations. Scholars from different countries actually have cultural diplomacy that they engage in just by advancing the body of work in their field of discipline. So those two things, for me, are the two central, I believe, things that I have seen other of my colleagues have asked me about, and that I believe will actually bring more, I guess, more of a streamlined process to decolonization.
Okay, so thank you all for, again, your answers to these questions. I think they're really insightful, really eye-opening for sure. And definitely appreciate, your comment about thinking about it as opposed to like, how can we get more representation? How can we get more Black and brown faces in these spaces and kind of overcome the systemic barriers to these opportunities? So one person had a question. I think we will make this the last question for the day for the panel. And I will try to actually loop it into a question also submitted from the RSVP. So let me find it. So the original question was basically asking about how do you write about your identity or as a Black person, your experiences without jeopardizing your application or scaring away the committee? How much is too much? How, I guess, if you will, how Black can you be, or how much of yourself can you be? So that's the first question, just kind of identity in the application process. How much of that do you share? And then I will broadly ask if you have just any general tips for securing either a competitive fellowship if you have one, or just pursuing your opportunity abroad. I think that's a great way to end. So people who are interested or want to kind of relay that to other people who are watching, I think to the point of the last question, one of the ways we increase representation is having panels like this, having people share their perspectives, showing that it can be done, and giving advice on how to, let other prospects in the next generations move forward and have the same opportunities that we've been fortunate to have. So we will end with that if everyone can answer that question.
I'll just answer for Fulbright and keep the order. So really I'll only speak for the English teaching assistantship, although I have advised people in the research track. I know the ETA track the best. So tips in terms of writing the personal statement and a statement of grant purpose. The statement of grant purpose, I'll start with that. Really just needs to exhibit how your commentative experiences are deserving, I guess, to send you specifically to that country to be ETA. Now that can look like a lot of different things. It can be experiences that you've had prior in the international space. For me, I didn't have a lot of experiences in the international space. So I had to be very intentional about why I wanted to go to the country I wanted to go to, and also how some of the tangible skills from my major in business could translate to being an effective culture ambassador, but also translate to being an effective English teacher from the standpoint of being able to linguistically build those barriers. And so I had to kind of draw from those experiences since I didn't have any international experiences, but I would draw from those international experiences. And then also there should be a point about how you plan to, navigate your professional area or space after the Fulbright, right? And with the personal statement, because, this is about the time that I get a lot of people who want me to read essays, they want me to critique and stuff. Personal statements, I personally do not mess with personal statements because you know yourself the best. So when it comes to personal statements, just generic advice. Don't write what you think they want to hear. I always say write from the heart. You don't have to try to intentionally pull the heartstrings, if you will. But I would just be very authentic, be very genuine, and just raw. And it will show. It will show. Trust me. So those are the two, I guess, two suggestions that I would give. Getting in the writing state or the state of mind for writing. People do different things. Maybe for me, I just like to have, tea and maybe some like music playing in the background, some like relaxing music, kind of just like decompress, get the mind, get the mental clear. But whatever works for you is also probably beneficial to get in that right state of mind, so you can just pour your life experiences onto the paper as well. So I hope that helps.
So thank you, Jordyn. So I'll follow. So when the question was asked, you may have seen me get excited because this is actually what I studied as far as how Black people, and particularly Black kind of applicants, narrate their ITs and college personal statements, and whether or not people exploit trauma to gain acceptance to predominantly white or historically white institutions. So firstly, I applied and was a Gates-Cambridge scholar. Again, that's a scholarship specifically for the University of Cambridge in England, funded by Bill and Melinda. We could say a lot of problematic things about them, but they helped me secure the bag. So the scholarship is super competitive, frankly. Students, if you generally, whatever your last degree program is, if your GPA should be 3.5 or higher, frankly. And I'm saying this as someone who also advised on the fellowship. And for Cambridge, I feel like the United States, we take as a former admissions officer, we take a very holistic approach to education. They do not. It's very, how are your research experience in particular in the UK system is very important. So past research experiences. And also the Gates Cambridge, love people who are going to save the world. So for better or for worse, it's about what your research is and also how you're going to use your research, whether stem cell or cancer or education. How is that going to help inform the world? How is it going to help form practices? And that's both in the West, the global South, and et cetera. And I think for personal narratives, I always tell people, tell your story in a way that you think is important, but realize that once you tell that story, there's someone on the other side reading it. And you may not know who that person is. And often we sign, we check that box to press submit. Our statements and essays go into a lot of different hands, and institutions often use those words to demonstrate their commitments to diversity and equity and inclusion. So you can find yourself on somebody's website. So just be mindful of that. But I think telling your story, particularly if you choose to share something that's painful or traumatic, but it's an experience that is incredibly important to your journey, tell that story and talk about how that has informed the work that you do, the work you want to do, and the person you are. I think that's incredibly important. But just be mindful that once you submit that story and that essay, it may be out of your hands. I don't think people should share trauma for trauma's sake or try to pimp out their particular narrative. But if you have a story that's personal, that connects to your larger goals, you tell that story in a way that's relevant and important to you. And I'm willing to talk to folks about the Gates Cambridge specifically, offline. So I think you all will have access to us. The application's due October 14th for the next academic year. So it is coming up early. So just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Aya. That was very informative. Regarding personal statements, I've often struggled with how, quote unquote, Black I should be and how I am presenting myself in a lot of these personal statements. And I felt the best method is just to be honest. I don't really go about it and try to list all my particular traumas or the particular hardships that I've had to overcome in order to get to where I am at, to apply for these particular organizations or opportunities. But if there's something relevant to what I'm applying to, I will include that. I do identify as Black, on my applications, but beyond that, I try to more directed towards what I'm interested in applying for. In case for my PhD, what was more important was not necessarily my own identity as a Black American, because I'm pursuing my PhD in New Zealand, it was how my research is going to help the New Zealand community or the community at large, or how it relates to them, or how I might connect with them or have similar experiences. And that's how I used it in order to help bolster my application. So I don't hide my identity, but I make it known. I show what's relevant, and then I show how I'm going to use that as a motivation to continue to help and attribute to them, and to give find the opportunities around to help the community here. And I found that was the most helpful and beneficial way to go about that.
Mine was an interesting one because it was China. I know, it's usually not in like people's bucket list to like study abroad in China, but like it was an interesting space for me because one, it was one of like it was like the second cohort when I joined, so it was like a pretty young program, really trying to figure things out. Peking University is called the Harvard of China, so it's also like a top university with a lot of resources. And they have been really trying to understand how they can attract more international students. So the cohort is a very small cohort of like less than 200 people from across different parts of the world. So they really tried to make it as international as possible. It's more international than Harvard. So it was like, every single time I was having a conversation with someone, or someone from Ukraine, someone from Mongolia, someone from here, someone from there, which really meant that going back to like the application process, you had to really think about the value add. It's such a small class of people from across the board. They're looking for top students across countries so that they can come in together and really talk about China, and how that means to their countries. So there was more of like an ambassadorial program, for the American, for Kenyans, for types of comes in is now kind of going back to your story about your uniqueness. I think one of the things that everyone should, I hope you all can hear me. One of the things that we all need to understand is that everyone has their own unique story, right? Everyone has their own journey that they have experienced. Everyone has their own ups and downs, their own traumas. And it's you understand what sets you apart. And once you understand what sets you apart, what is that unique code that you have, then you can really find that authentic narrative. And once you figure that out, then you can really convey what you add value to the class. Because at the end of the day, it's not just you learning, it's people learning from you. And that's why it's a cross-cultural conversation across the board, right? So if it's a cross-cultural conversation, you better be bringing something to this table. Because if you're not, then what's the point for you to go there? It's not just you learning, it's people learning from you. So then you have to really understand what you know and bring it to the table. So for me, I came from a background of trying to understand Chinese engagement in the continent. I tried to compare that with Japanese engagement in the continent. I was very fascinated by that. And I was coming in to say, okay, this is what I have learned from across my research. This is what I'm really interested in learning. These are the questions that I have, and this is why I want to learn. I want to hear the Chinese perspective from China, not from New York Times, not from Forbes, not from like an American-led newspaper article. I really want to get to the research from professors in the Chinese, ecosystem. So for me, it was really boiling down to, these are my experiences with research, these are experiences that I have when it comes to engaging with China in the continent. This is what I want to learn. This is what I want to offer to the community. And then the third most important part is beyond China, because at the end of the day, they want you to take it and go away with it, right? And they don't want to keep you in China. They want to ensure that you're going and spreading the gospel out there in the world and like promoting and navigating the space. So then what does it mean? What type of like engagement are you coming to bring or in terms of the table here, and how do you plan on pursuing it outside the Chinese, China? So for me, that then in the beginning, I thought about diplomacy. I really thought I wanted to be a diplomat until I got into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kenya and realized that's not my thing. There's so much corruption and bureaucracy. I was like, nah, that's not my value system. So I realized that entrepreneurship is an interesting angle to really bring value to the community and impact. So my learning lessons from Chinese history of entrepreneurship has been very pivotal for me to understand how to build the next Alibaba, how to build the next X, from a very much a perspective of being there, understanding how the system works, understanding how investment works, understanding some of these ins and outs of Chinese ecosystem that you never understand if you're not in China. So then you have to really understand why China, why does it have to be China? And what do you do beyond China? So to bring them back, the three of them is your unique story, the value add, as well as beyond and why China. So those are like the three key components of your story that you have to really focus on. And that can really open to a lot of gates. When you think about Japan, Japan has its own great PhD programs, from artificial intelligence to agriculture to across the board, manufacturing. The continent also has brilliant PhD programs. There's CMU Africa that is based in Rwanda. That's a master's program, for example. There's ALU, for example, ALX, which is based in Mauritius across different spaces. So there's other programs outside the Americas and the UK and in different emerging markets. So it's also a moment, we talked about decolonizing international education. I think it's also a moment for you to also be intentional with opportunities that you seek. There's more to see in the world. There's more culture to indulge in. There's more lessons to learn, and it doesn't have to be a very much Western focused. You can learn a little bit about, from doing business in Rwanda or doing business in India, and really pick up some of these things that can also help you with your story. Because at the end of the day, you have to be intentional on the story that you create. So if you're intentionally taking opportunities, then they can really shape your narrative in your next cohort or in your next Rhodes Scholarship application, because they don't just want any Tom, Dick, and Harry. They want someone who has a wide outlook of life, someone who is more open-minded. And you get this from internships, you get this from studying abroad, you get this from working and researching abroad. So yeah, so I think the first step is really to understand your unique selling point. Just like any product that we sell, you have to understand you're selling yourself. So what is your unique selling point? And how do you position yourselves to ensure that you're offering value to the opportunities that you're seeking for? And what do you do beyond that opportunity? Because at the end of the day, they don't want to put you in the UK. They want you to go spread the narrative. So what do you do beyond that program? And why does it have to be that program, not any other program? So once you master those, then you can really write that compelling essay and be competitive with when it comes to the application process and get that dream scholarship that you have been keen on accomplishing. And if you don't get it, there are other opportunities. We usually say rejection is more of a, what do you call this? Like deterrence, like you're just being deflected to a different other opportunity. So you don't need to be let down by one rejection. There are other different things that you can do in the world. So just see that as an opportunity to like streamline your story and strengthen your story. And it's an iterative process. You don't have one story, it keeps on iterating. As long as you iterate, you're able to sell yourself every single time. So see it as an iterative process, and then you can really learn from it. You learn about yourself, you learn about so many things that you can use when you're applying for a job and other different aspects of life.
If I can just shortly add for my part for the Gilman Scholarship, it mostly is focused on highlighting what you want to do upon your return. And so for me, that was highlighting, expressing to other African-American students at my university, as well as high school students coming into college, trying to determine in the African-American community if they could afford to go, or if there were ways for them to go. So me going as a Gilman scholar, I used my own resources because I paid for college myself. I took out loans myself. I did the application processes for scholarships and everything myself, to use that information and everything that I've learned while I prepared to go abroad to bring it back to students here. So finding discounted flights or finding which flight companies were the cheapest to use, finding ways to get banks there if you don't want to keep your bank here, or phone plans so you can still use your phone in different countries, or if you would just rather keep using Wi-Fi. That's what the Gilman Scholarship wanted to highlight, was what we could bring back with us to encourage other minority students that they could do it and make sure that their dreams are possible, especially if you come from impoverished areas or low income. Where I was raised, those are things you think that money is always going to be a factor that stops you from getting to where you want to be, which was something that I had to overcome myself. And it takes a lot of determination, yes, but to have those little tricks and tips was something that I used, and something that I wrote a whole blog post on upon my return back, to highlight little ways to know things, or like if you wanted to independent travel, best ways to budgets, or learning the language to just know basic language barriers so you can help prevent those on your way there, and making sure that you're comfortable asking questions, but also realizing that you're getting to go do an incredible thing, and it opens so many more doors for you, and to just make sure that that's pleasable and plausible and that those things can happen, are And like, so that's what I highlighted. If someone wants to have a conversation about that, or find ways that if you have to help finance part of your trip abroad yourself, I would gladly love to have a conversation about that. That's something that I absolutely enjoy doing. And I've encouraged so many students from the area that I went to my university and with my partnering study abroad university to encourage other American students to go, that it's plausible to go, and that there are means and scholarships and doors and funding to get you there.
Where there's a will, there's a way. So it sounds like general advice: be authentic, tell your narrative, be mindful that, you know, people may share your stories or use them to highlight the program or recruit, to know, to love yourself. And all of these people here are resources. And I echo all of the sentiments shared here. You know, in the event that you apply for something and maybe you don't get it, that's okay. There's always a way to, you know, make a path for something that you want to do. And I'm sure we could have a whole nother panel discussion on how each and every single one of us has overcome some obstacle or some failure / redirection. So with that, we are going to officially close out the panel. Thank you so much again to each and every single panelist, especially for staying over time. But this conversation was just too, it was too good. We had to, you know, hear your perspective. So I really appreciate you all for taking the time out, especially those in the 10 p.m., 5 a.m. time zones in New Zealand and in Kenya. Thank you so much. Thank you for the participants who have been hanging out with us for the extra time and the extra wisdom. This meeting is being recorded, so it will be uploaded at some point and shared with the public. So feel free to spread the joy and the knowledge. And I will also be sending out a follow-up survey. So everyone who RSVP'd and put their email, I will send you all an email and discuss ways that you all can continue to stay connected with the panelists. One of which can be Instagram or Twitter. So plugging Black and Global again, make sure you follow on Twitter and Black and Global Week on Instagram. So thank you all again. Appreciate you.